All right, fantastic. Hello, I'm Chris McGee here at Rockwood South Middle School, and I have the amazing pleasure of having the opportunity to speak with Mr. David Price, author of Open: How We Will Work, Live, and Learn in the Future. I love that concept of thinking forward and looking ahead, and I can't thank you enough for taking the time to write the book and taking the time today to be a part of this experience.
Thank you. You're very welcome. It's taken us a while to get this organized, but I'm glad we persevered.
Yeah, absolutely. So tell us the story of David Price. What brought you to writing this book, or even the work that you're doing today?
Oh, wow. So I guess I was a kind of reluctant recruit into education. I actually started my working life as a professional musician, and that's not a common route. But I ended up working in the performing arts industry, and then you reach a point when you're a gigging musician where you think this isn't a job for a grown-up, and I thought, okay, I'll go to college. So I went to college quite late. I think I was about 28, 29, and I had no plan whatsoever. But through a series of opportunities which just presented themselves, I worked first in community education, and then adult education, and then into much more formal education. And my last kind of proper job was heading up the I was director of learning at the Liverpool Institute for Performing Arts, which was a new tertiary performing arts college in Liverpool. And I did that for about 7 or 8 years. And when I stopped doing that, I wanted to do some work as a freelancer. So I kind of became, I suppose this was 2001, I kind of became the person that I talk about a lot in the book, which I think our kids are going to have to be in the future, which is, developing a portfolio career. And now when people ask me what I do for a living, I say I really don't know, because it's just a huge variety of things that I do, working both in the corporate world as well as in the education world. But I guess about 3/4 of my work is working with teachers in various countries, in the US, UK, Australia, India, pretty much most of the English-speaking countries. And I do quite a bit of training with that. And it was becoming apparent, it seemed to me anyway, that there was, if you just look, for example, at the world of professional development, that it's changed incredibly, or it is in the process of changing. There are almost two parallel threads to professional development. There's the stuff that you kind of have to do because your school wants you to do that. And then there's the stuff that you really want to do, which you kind of do at home through Twitter, the kind of thing that we're doing now. And it seemed to me that that division between formal and informal was being replicated everywhere. From the lives that our kids lead, the kind of hidden lives of learners. This isn't actually in the book, but my eldest son, at one point, this is going back quite a few years now, I discovered by accident that he was actually taking part in internet chat show programs. And I did the usual kind of parental shock horror. And then I realized he was talking about libertarian politics, at which point I thought, well, it can't be too bad if he's doing that. But I said, why don't you just record it, and then you don't have to stay up in the middle of the night, because it was a US-based thing. And he said, but I can't do that because I'm a panelist. I'm actually a contributor. He was 15 at the time. And I thought, wow, I had no idea that he was doing this. More importantly, his school had no idea. And so he's just one of many, many examples of kids that I come across now who are doing really interesting, fun learning outside of the formal context. And my concern was seeing these two worlds operating separately, I think isn't in the best interest of either our learners or our teachers. And so I guess the book was an attempt to say there's a lot of things happening out there, and we need to make sure that we recognize it's happening. I'm absolutely not trying to turn teachers into, social media fanatics. but it is about recognizing the immediacy of the kind of learning which is taking place in the informal sector. And I don't just mean when you're sitting in front of a computer screen now. I mean, you know, people face to face doing that kind of stuff. The learning is becoming much more of a self-organized activity in the informal sector. And yet, conversely, what I was seeing, certainly in the UK, and I think to a certain extent in the US, was a kind of, you know, the drilling and killing thing, which is concerned a lot of people. And so the division between not just the experiences, but the kinds of skills that our learners develop in those contexts, to me, was really concerning. So what I wanted to do was to make sure that, you know, we at least recognize that this is going on, and then to see what we can do, not just how we organize our classrooms, but how we organize the whole concept of school. And, you know, one of the things I talk about in the book is the idea of school as a kind of global learning commons, to recognize that, you know, perhaps we may not have noticed it, but over the last 10, 15 years, I guess, schools have become somewhat kind of inward looking and almost fortresses. And of course, we know the reasons for this are well known. But at the same time, it seems to me, if ever we wanted to kind of say to kids that they're not, the learning that they're doing is not part of the world that's going on outside the school, then I think, you know, giving them worksheets to go through when there's all this other stuff happening, and they could be doing that, is a kind of pretty sobering experience, I think, for a lot of teachers. So to cut a long story short, all my work, I guess, in the last 20, 25 years has been around engagement, learner engagement, and innovation in education. And it just seemed to me that the book was an opportunity to bring some of those things together in the context of how can we look forward? Because I don't know what it's like in the US right now, but certainly in the UK, we're looking back. You know, we've just had the Secretary of State for Education announce that there's going to be, the next big government idea is grammar schools, you know, which first appeared in the 1950s. And there are many politicians who'd like to see us back there then, you know, would like to see kids in compliant rows. But the world's just not like that anymore. So the stance I was trying to take in the book was, let's look ahead. Let's look at where employment is going. Let's look at where society is going. And let's see if we can put learning right in the center of that and not on the periphery.
I found, you know, through your conversation there, and also through reading the day, an attempt to validate that right side of the parallel of, yes, sitting and getting, you know, talked at in a professional learning conference environment is important and is valid, but so is this, and maybe even equally so, or maybe even more so, that this informal concept of, I just want to learn quickly about a concept, maybe at a surface level, or even through interest, I want to dive deeper into a bigger concept. That opportunity, that space, that breath of air for our kids is just as valid for our adults and for our adult learners, and even in our communities. Recognizing that informality as just as valid, I think, is a big key takeaway for me.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, you know, so what I was trying to do in the book was to say some of these issues go beyond formal learning in schools, colleges, and universities. The same thing is happening in the workplace, and we are trying to kind of recognize the way we learn as adults, when actually the possibility of much more self-determined learning exists now. The technology makes that possible. And so, you know, people in workplace learning, trainers in corporations are facing exactly the same problems. They're saying, yeah, we want our learning to be more informal. We want it to be more learner-centered. But how do we manage that process? You know, and I think that's what we're still trying to find ways of doing.
Is it a process that needs to be managed, or a process that needs to be cultivated or curated? That just a different model of thinking about it, what might bring about a different solution?
Exactly. And a short while ago, I kind of did a review of a fascinating experiment, which has proven to be so successful it's still going on. School in the northwest of England, and they said, why don't we just see what happens when we let the kids organize the learning themselves? Now, they knew they couldn't do this Monday to Friday, so they decided they'd open the school on a Saturday morning, and literally they would have the learners come in, and it was entirely up to them how they drove their learning. They brought in some peer learners who were students, a couple of years older than them at a community college, and they were kind of learning coaches. The staff came in, the teaching staff came in, but they just made teas and coffees for the kids. Everyone assumed that the kids would want to do all the kind of fun stuff. When they were completely left to their own devices, they chose to do test prep, which, confounded everyone. But they did it in a really remarkable way, where I described it as was like this river of learning where kids were moving from one classroom to another. These learning coaches were being brought in, and it was completely spontaneous. It was incredibly powerful. And when I spoke to these kids afterwards, I interviewed 3 young girls, and I said, I'd observed them for about an hour, and they were deeply immersed in polynomials, stuff that I have no idea what they were talking about, but I watched them achieve a kind of breakthrough, and they were saying, yeah, we got it today. We've been really struggling with it in our classes, but this gives us a chance. And I said, what is it about this that is powerful to you? And they said, well, I can't stop the teacher in a class and say, sorry, could you just do that again? I didn't get it. But here, because the kids that we're working with are only a couple of years older than us, yeah, we can do that. We feel like sometimes we want to shift the learning into something else, but we know the teacher's prepared something, so we can't interrupt that. And they proceeded to give a really great analysis. And at the end of it, I said, so if it's so great, why isn't school like this? And they said, because there's a limit to the amount of free learning you can do. And they used that phrase, free learning, and I thought that's a terrific phrase. But, they recognize that there needs to be a balance. There's just times when they need to learn formally, but they also wanted to have an opportunity to delve deep into some subjects as their passion took them. And as it happened, they did a review of that particular initiative, and they found that kids who'd gone in there on a Saturday, and it went from small numbers to over 30% of the school population now goes every Saturday. And lo and behold, when they've looked at the test scores, the kids who do this, as well as the conventional learning, are at least 1 grade ahead on average compared to the other kids. So I sometimes think we just don't trust our learners enough. We think that they'll be too frivolous, too superficial if we allow them to organize their own learning. And I think we need to do more of that kind of thing.
Yeah, and I've, in my experience in working with middle school kids and using a concept of 20% time or genius hour in my classroom, I find that we often started at the frivolous, but when I engaged them in celebrating the frivolous, they had a tendency to up-level their next project and their next concept and continue to push the envelope forward. Them not wanting to take a risk or not knowing how to unlearn the confines of their traditional learning environment, you had to go through the frivolous in order to get to the deeper learning, so that way they knew it's okay here to be silly, to fail, to kind of author my own path, whatever that is. I know I had a kid who typed his name 10,000 times. That was what he wanted to do for one of his projects. And I know that sounds silly, but he became our tech expert in the room because he learned the tool and the resource that we were working with at the time better than anybody else, because he had played within that environment, doing the simple task of typing his name, but also learning how to use the tool, how to manipulate the text, how to arrange it in different ways that I didn't even know. But that be able to be our leader in that different environment.
Yeah. And I think this is where, for me, finding the kind of the relevance outside of the place we call school is critical to some of this self-determined learning. So some of the most powerful examples I've seen in Australia, there's a primary school that I work in a lot down there, and they've got fantastic links with their community. And when you put an 8th grade student in with a senior citizen, and the eighth graders trying to show that senior citizen how to use the internet and how to do stuff, and they're also listening to their stories and doing oral histories, then that tendency to be frivolous soon falls away. That's
perfect.
Right.
Yeah, absolutely. Where did your concept of the global learning commons come from? What stemmed that? How many times did you play with that name and that concept before you kind of landed where you were?
Yeah. Oh, wow. A long time. I led up a program in the UK called Learning Futures, which was we worked with about 40 high schools in the UK around innovation. And I remember one day we were talking about, as I had all the senior leaders in the room, and I remember saying to them, we're looking at this through the lens of the engaged student. How do we get the student engaged? I said, but surely one of the things we need to think about is we can only get engaged students when we get engaged schools. And they all kind of scratched their heads and said, what are you talking about? And in truth, I didn't know. I was just working these ideas out at the time. But what I meant, I guess, was that if the school's engaged with its parents, if it's engaged with the local community, then that's going to lead to more opportunities for our students to become engaged. And I think this is one area, certainly it's an area that I'm passionate about now, because I do a lot of parental engagement workshops. So I work with schools as to how can they get the parents much more engaged rather than just, raising funds and doing the usual kind of stuff. And I just, I remembered that, back in the 17th and 18th century in the UK, there was this notion of common land, which was that when you, in the feudal society in England, if you owned a couple of sheep and maybe a few cattle, you could put them on common land, which no one owned, and there were no fences up. You just had to be responsible. You had to make sure you didn't overgraze, and you had to handle that land responsibly. And so I thought, yeah, it is that notion of a commons. And actually, once I started looking at that, there is a big movement around the world around environmental commons, around energy commons, that this concept that actually we need to share what we own and not rely on other people to set those boundaries for us. And if you do a Google for educational commons, nothing comes up. And I thought, it's really interesting that this concept seems to have not touched education and learning. And so I played around with that idea, although frankly, I used to say to people, I think schools should be like global learning commons. And they just go, I don't know what you're talking about. So for a while, I just thought, okay, I need to find a different way to put this. And then it was only after the book came out, I now visit schools, and some of them even have a sign up, saying that it's a global learning commons. And I think, wow, it's finally landed as a kind of concept. But whatever we need to call it, we have the potential, it seems to me now, to be able to have our kids engaged in service learning in their local community, but through technology, collaborating with kids anywhere in the world. And I've seen more of that happen in the last 3-4 years, and I think it's really exciting.
Yeah, I think one of the big conversations I've had with any educator that I work with is who's the audience for this work, and if we truly think of creating and come from a concept of the end user, we have a tendency to not stop at a worksheet or at a set of problems from a book or anything like that, because we're authoring something or we're creating something for someone. And at the end, I'm going to hand it to you and say, I did this for you. And really being able to have that lens on something really brings about a change and a shift in what we're going to do, why we're doing it, and that sort of thinking. Yeah,
and a desire to take that learning further. I don't know if you've seen the film that's currently going around, Most Likely to Succeed. Larry Rosenstock at High Tech High talks about when they have those public exhibitions and 700-800 people turn up, and the kids are thinking, I did this, everyone is coming to see it. So it has a real kind of significance. I think what we see, certainly in this country, what we're seeing is this division, this kind of either or. So you can either have your kids engaged and doing all this kind of service-based learning, or you can have them do well in exams. And that's a false dichotomy, it seems to me. So you get schools like Silverdale School in India that I visited and worked with, and they have all kinds of service projects involving the kids, and yet they have the highest exam results in the state of New Delhi. So it isn't an either or, it's an and if you can get it right.
Yeah, that's great. So as you're touring the world and as you're involved in different either organizations or schools or communities, what things have you seen that have sort of really from either from the book or things that you've learned that are some of the kind of core tenets that that really seem to be moving those high tech highs and other schools like that forward? What are some of those core values that you see?
I think there's a number of things, you know, and one of the interesting things about High Tech High is that, you know, the staff who work, they say, just because our school's successful, don't try to replicate High Tech High. Each school has got to find its own way of responding to its community needs, the needs of its students. But there are some common features that we see, and the kind of foregrounding of values-based education, it seems to me, is one of them. The concept of, I often say that when you go into the really innovative schools, you see people, whether they're adults or students, who are fascinated about how learning works. So there's a kind of shared vocabulary about learning. You know, some of the great schools that I've worked in, they'll take all the staff off for a weekend and they'll just read books about learning. They'll talk about learning, what makes learning great. And so I think that concept of metacognition as adults is just as important. But too often, I think schools, they may have that conversation, but they'll just keep it within themselves. What I do in the parents' workshops is to open that up to parents. And oftentimes schools will say, you know, our parents aren't really that interested in learning theory. I'm not sure this is going to fly. You do a 2-hour workshop with them, and it's amazing to see. And, you know, often parents don't actually see what's going on in the classroom. They just have to go on trust. Have a conversation about, well, what kind of learning is it? And what kind of outcomes do you want for your kids? What should be the design principles of a school? Actually, they realize, first of all, this teaching game is much more complicated than they thought it was. So they kind of have a respect for teachers, because when they've got 15 different priorities about what they think the learning should be, they recognize that any school is trying to balance all of those. But I think also they then start to get into a conversation which isn't driven by grades. It's not driven by numbers and letters. And they start to say, okay, what is it that really matters for our kids? So I think that's one of the other factors. I do think, for me, that the schools that I go to have a respect for traditional forms of pedagogy. They understand that sometimes the quickest way to learn something is for you to stand at the front and tell the kids. They're not embarrassed about that, but equally, they don't think that there's just a couple of tools in the toolkit that you can use. They will use whatever it is. And one of the distressing things I sometimes see now on Twitter when I see educators having these conversations is that somehow you've got to be in one extreme or the other. You know, you're either a traditionalist or you're a so-called progressive. And it's nonsense, because most of the good teachers I know will use whatever tool comes to hand. So they might have some project-based learning, but they might be doing straight stand-up lecturing when it's appropriate. So I think that utility about learning and not having a kind of ideological bent is another one of those characteristics. And then finally, I guess the other thing about some of those great schools is that they have leaders who are in it for the long game. In a study, I don't know if you saw it, carried out last year, it was in the Harvard Business Review, and they looked at the types of school leaders who are successful, and they look at their own particular modus operandi, and they give them names. So the surgeon is the school leader who, you know, gets brought in to turn around a school, fires half the staff, has a big emphasis upon test results and discipline. And sure enough, they can turn around the school in 2 years. Scores go up. These people get very well paid. We've got people in the UK now who are earning nearly £500,000 a year as a CEO of a number of schools. They get hugely well paid. But when you look at the pattern, after a while, they can't sustain that. The school leaders that I've seen are what this review would call architects. They're people who are in it for the long haul. They know that if they just concentrate on test scores, eventually they'll hit a plateau. So what they do is they build up a learning community both within and outside of that school. They don't fire people. They try to bring them in, and they share a kind of joint mission. And sure, the school may take a while to get where it needs to be, but you see year-on-year increase. And that would be, that would be characteristic of most of the, if I thought now of the kind of, top 7 or 8 schools in the world that I've been lucky enough to visit, they'd all have those kinds of leaders. They consult, they listen. Yeah, they've got a vision, but they know that they can't be the guy who does it all, the guy who says, this is the direction that we're going in, and you either follow me or you find somewhere else to work. The evidence is showing that those kind of leaders will get short-term results, but long-term, it's not in the school's best interest.
All right, I'll wrap it up with this. What's your hope for the future? What would be the dream if you could go into that crystal ball and look at what, and I hesitate to use the word school, but let's change that and remove it and just talk about learning. So what would learning be like in the future, even if we just sort of remove the word school for a moment? What's your hope for that?
Well, I think, and it's funny you should ask that question, because I'm grappling with this right now, because I'm working on the next book, which I think what we've seen over the last 10, 15 years has been that there's, initially we shared knowledge, and we got really excited about that, and it's just become part of our lives. Nobody cooks a meal now by pulling a recipe book off the shelf. We just get a YouTube video and we follow that. So we share all of that. But then I think we got to the next stage quite quickly, which was about, okay, well, what can we do with that knowledge? And what I'm fascinated about now is the way in which it's what I call people-powered innovation. So we're now at the point, I think, where people can go much further in terms of their creativity. So if you think about something like skateboard, which was developed by surfers in the winter because they couldn't get out on the water, and they cannibalized a pair of roller skates and a plank board, and they made it, and they weren't really interested in what happened to it. They just used it for their own purposes. Along came the big commercial manufacturers, took it off their hands and scaled it up. Well, we're now at the point, I think, where because we can own the means of production through 3D printing, through capital, through Kickstarter, through all those kind of peer-to-peer lending services, that we can actually get into the process of production. So what might that mean for learning? It seems to me that there's a kind of utopian vision and there's a dystopian vision about the way that the world's working. And we see this now in almost every time you pick up a newspaper, you get the sense of the robots are coming, our jobs aren't going to be safe, we're going to have mass unemployment. And yes, that is a real possibility. But what would it be like if we completely rethought the purpose of learning so that we could have what the governor of the Bank of England, a Canadian guy called Mark Carney, recently said was the artisanal society, where we are working as artisans again. We have the means. There are small companies now who can 3D print you a house. Now, when you can do that, and I was working at the end of this recent long trip, I was working in an international school in Brussels, and they were doing a hackathon with these kids. And I saw 2 kids who had been completely turned off from learning, stay up till 2 each evening, because they had come up with an idea for 3D printing dog prosthetics for animals who've lost a limb. Now the learning that took place in the space of one weekend was unbelievable. And they presented their ideas to all these teachers who'd come from all around the world, about 400 teachers, and began by saying, we're a not-for-profit and we're existing to make dogs happier again. And it was an incredible pitch that they put together. And when people then grilled them as to, what had they learned through doing this, it was an incredible amount. And as far as they're concerned, they're now going to do this with a whole bunch of vets, veterinarians in Brussels. And I just thought that's a little glimpse of what learning be taking it from. Let's do some research into an area. Okay, great. Other schools say, well, let's take that a little bit further. Let's do a project, which is great. But actually, when schools start to become collections of small-scale enterprises, social enterprises that are doing useful work for society, we're not just teaching kids in ways that feel vital and dynamic to them. I think we're actually preparing them for the way the world is going to be, because the days of the big corporations are over, and increasingly these kids are going to have to work as freelancers or start their own small businesses. So I think that for me is the utopian part of it. We can rethink the whole purpose of schooling. And I often say to teachers when I get them together, I say, just imagine you were starting all over again. There wasn't 10 subjects in the curriculum. You had a completely blank piece of paper, but you had to design a curriculum for the next 30, 40 years. What would it look like? It doesn't look anything like the environment that they're having to work and teach in. The Committee of 10 came up with a curriculum in, 1894? And it stayed the same.
Something like that, yeah.
It's crazy. Well, the world's changed. So I think what I hope is going to happen is that policymakers and politicians around the world will stop looking back, will stop looking towards PISA league tables, because they don't tell you anything. They don't tell you how the country's doing in terms of its level of innovation. But they will start to say, okay, we need to now bring about some fairly radical changes in the way that we organize this thing that we call school. And we need to ask teachers to do that for us, because they keep doing it on 4 or 5 year electoral cycles, and all we do is just spin our wheels. So I'm still hopeful, but there's no doubt in my mind that if we don't start to think like this, then there's going to be a point, and I speculated in the book, it's when the degree isn't a guarantee of a job, when middle class parents realize, that this is a lot of money they're spending to get their kid through college, and actually they're no better off than the kid who's now an electrician working in people's houses around the local community. So I think there'll come a crunch point where we realize that if we don't rethink education, our kids are going to rebel, and we need to get in ahead of that curve.
Outstanding.
That answers your question, but
yeah, outstanding. I can't thank you enough for your time today. I know that I want to get you back to regular life, if you will. But if you are not reading this book out there in the world, you need to read this book, because it is a fantastic resource, and there is not a single page that isn't underlined, dog-eared, highlighted, written on as a resource for me to come back to and to really celebrate the idea of learning forward and really thinking about what learning might be in the future.
Well, thank
you.
So,
Mr. Price, amazing. Thank you for your time, and we will chat soon, I hope.
Great. Thanks a lot. Great to meet you, Chris. Take care.